Get out, Vance. We're restructuring, and frankly, a $220,000 salary for a glorified property manager is a luxury this company can no longer afford. Bradley Thorne, the new 34-year-old chief operating officer, didn't even look up from his tablet as he slid the blue termination folder across the mahogany conference table. HR Director Brenda Croft sat next to him, her hands folded, looking at the ceiling. I didn't flinch. I reached out, picked up my black Mont Blanc pen, and signed the acknowledgement of termination receipt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just stood up, adjusted my Navy suit, and said, "Understood. I will have my personal effects cleared by 5. Bradley let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Make it 3, Keith. Donald starts tomorrow, and he'll need the desk." I smiled, picked up my leather portfolio, and walked out. They thought they were trimming the fat. They didn't realize they had just pulled the pin on a 20-year-old legal landmine. To understand how we got to that mahogany table, you have to go back to 2006. Back then, Omnispace Properties was a mid-tier regional developer run by Richard Thorne, Bradley's father. Richard was a tough old-school builder who understood that real estate isn't about shiny glass towers. It is about who owns the dirt underneath them. Omnispace had a vision to build the Pinnacle Galleria, a massive $120 million lifestyle center that would dominate the county. But they had a major problem: land assembly. The proposed site for the mall was a collection of 12 separate parcels. Omnispace bought 11 of them easily. But the 12th parcel, the crown jewel right in the dead center of the property, belonged to my grandfather, Howard Vance. It was a prime 2.5-acre plot of commercial land that sat exactly where the main entrance and the footprint of the flagship anchor tenant, Vanguard Department Store, were planned. Without my grandfather's parcel, the mall could not be built. The county's zoning laws required a contiguous layout, and trying to build around our land would have resulted in an awkward, non-functional design that no high-end retailer would touch. Richard Thorne tried to buy the land outright. He offered my grandfather $4 million, which was a fair market valuation at the time. But my grandfather was a farmer who had seen developers buy land cheap, build empires, and leave the original owners with nothing. He refused to sell. He wanted long-term security for his family, specifically for me. I was 26 at the time, fresh out of college with a degree in real estate finance and working a low-level leasing job in the city. My grandfather made Richard Thorne a deal. He would lease the 2.5-acre parcel to Omnispace Properties on a 20-year commercial ground lease. The rent would be heavily subsidized at just $10,000 a month, or $120,000 a year. For a prime commercial space in a major development, that was practically charity. But the subsidy came with a very strict, non-negotiable rider. Under Section 14D of the lease agreement, named the Personnel Keyman Clause, the subsidized rate was tied directly to my employment at Omnispace. The clause was simple but ironclad. It stated that Omnispace Properties must employ me, Keith Vance, as the Senior Managing Director of Property Operations for the entire duration of the lease. As long as I remained in that role, the rent remained at $10,000 a month. But if I was terminated without cause, the lease subsidy would immediately void. The rent would automatically adjust to the current market rate, to be determined by an independent appraisal, retroactive to the beginning of the current fiscal year. Furthermore, if Omnispace failed to pay the adjusted rent within 14 days of receiving the appraisal notice, the lease would terminate, and the landowner would have the right to reclaim the parcel, including any improvements built upon it. Richard Thorne, desperate to break ground and secure his financing, agreed. He hired me as an assistant property manager in 2011, and I worked my way up over 15 years. I knew every pipe, every tenant lease, every electrical main, and every structural column in the Pinnacle Galleria. I managed the daily operations, kept tenant retention at 98%, and maintained a flawless relationship with the local planning board. For 15 years, Richard and I worked side by side. He paid me a fair salary of $220,000, and in return, Omnispace saved millions of dollars in ground rent. It was a perfect, mutually beneficial partnership. But then, in late 2025, Richard's health began to fail. He suffered a stroke that forced him to step down from daily operations and retreat to his estate in Florida. The board of directors, largely controlled by the Thorne family, appointed Richard's son, Bradley, as the new chief operating officer. Bradley was a business school graduate who had never mixed concrete or negotiated with a local union. He looked at the company through spreadsheets. To him, the Pinnacle Galleria was a mature asset that was spending too much on overhead. He didn't understand the history, and he certainly didn't respect the old guard. He brought in his own inner circle, including Brenda Croft, a ruthless HR director whose primary talent was finding legal loopholes to deny employees their pensions and benefits. The real trouble started in January 2026, when we completed the Phase 2 expansion of the mall. The expansion added 60,000 square feet of premium retail space, increasing the overall valuation of the Pinnacle Galleria by $50 million. My contract, which had been updated in 2021, explicitly stated that I was entitled to a 5% performance bonus based on the net value increase of any expansion project I oversaw. That bonus amounted to $2.5 million. When I submitted the final independent valuation report and the invoice for my bonus to Bradley's office, he ignored it for 3 weeks. When he finally called me in, he had a smug smile on his face. He told me the company was facing cash flow constraints and that he couldn't justify paying a $2.5 million bonus to an employee who already earned a 6-figure salary. He offered me a $50,000 discretionary bonus instead, asking me to sign a waiver releasing the company from any future claims. I refused. I told him the contract was clear and that the bonus was legally binding. Bradley's smile vanished. He told me that contracts are just pieces of paper and that his lawyers could drag a lawsuit out for a decade before I ever saw a dime. I walked out of his office, refusing to sign the waiver. 2 days later, I was called to the mahogany conference room. Bradley and Brenda were waiting. Brenda handed me the blue folder. They were terminating my contract for performance redundancy, claiming that my role as Senior Managing Director of Property Operations was being combined with a junior administrative position to streamline operations. The junior position was to be filled by Donald Finch, Bradley's brother-in-law, who had recently flunked out of a junior college and had 0 property management experience. They offered me 2 weeks severance, provided I signed a non-disclosure agreement and a waiver of all outstanding claims, including the Phase 2 bonus. If I refused, they threatened to fire me with cause, citing fabricated reports of poor leadership and failure to meet operational targets. They thought they had me cornered. They thought a 46-year-old property manager would panic at the prospect of losing his income and sign whatever paper they put in front of him. But as I signed the simple acknowledgement of termination receipt, the only document I actually signed, I looked at Bradley's smug face and felt a deep, calm satisfaction. He had no idea what he had just done. He had just handed me the key to dismantle his entire empire. Let's see how his brother-in-law manages a mall when the flagship store is legally sitting on private property. Let's see how they handle the next 14 days. The transition was supposed to take 2 weeks, but Bradley was in a hurry to show everyone who was boss. By the next morning, my security badge had already been deactivated for the executive parking deck. I had to park in the common customer lot, walking past the massive glass facade of the Vanguard department store to get to the management office. As I walked, I looked at the concrete expansion joints, the pristine landscaping, and the loading docks. I had spent 15 years of my life maintaining this property. I knew that the main sewer line ran directly under my grandfather's parcel, and that the electrical conduits feeding the entire eastern wing of the mall were routed through a subterranean trench on our land. Bradley didn't know any of this. To him, it was just square footage. When I entered the management suite, Donald Finch was already sitting in my leather chair. He had his feet on my desk, looking at a sports game on his phone. Donald was 32, wore a loud, cheap suit, and smelled of heavy cologne. He looked up, giving me a dismissive nod. "Hey, Keith." Bradley said, "You're here to hand over the master keys and the tenant folders. Just put them in the bin there. I've got a meeting with the regional leasing team in an hour, so I don't really have time for a full tour." I looked at him, feeling a wave of pity. He didn't even know how to access the building automation system, let alone how to handle a major tenant dispute. "The keys are color-coded," I said calmly, placing the heavy brass ring on the desk. "The red keys are for the mechanical rooms. The blue ones are for the roof access and the HVAC platforms. The yellow ones are the master overrides for the retail corridors. You should keep them in the wall safe behind the desk." Donald waved his hand dismissively. "Yeah, safe. Got it. What about the tenant files? Where are the digital copies?" "They're on the local server," I replied. "But I've compiled the physical lease summaries here in this binder. It includes all the special covenants, co-tenancy clauses, and easement agreements. I strongly suggest you read the Vanguard lease. It has some very specific operational requirements. Vanguard is a corporate tenant, Keith. They pay their rent via electronic transfer every month." "There's nothing to manage," Donald sneered, turning back to his phone. "We're focusing on digital marketing now. Bradley wants to replace the physical directory boards with interactive touchscreens. That's where the real money is." I didn't argue. I packed the remaining items from my desk into a single cardboard box: my personal photos, my grandfather's old Surveyor Transit, and my copy of the 2006 ground lease agreement. As I walked out, Brenda Croft was waiting in the corridor. She had a clipboard in hand, looking at me with a cold, professional smile. "Keith, we've processed your final 2 weeks of regular salary," she said. "However, the board has officially rejected your claim for the Phase 2 expansion bonus. We've reviewed the 2021 contract amendment, and our legal department has determined that the 5% performance bonus was conditional on the company achieving a specific debt-to-equity ratio, which was not met due to the rising interest rates on our construction loans. We've prepared a separation agreement that includes a $75,000 severance package, but you must sign it today to waive any further claims. I looked at the document she held out. Brenda, the debt-to-equity clause you're referring to only applies to secondary joint ventures, not the main Galleria expansion. Section 7 of my contract is unconditional. I spent the last 3 years working 80-hour weeks to get Phase 2 built under budget. The company's valuation went up by $50 million because of my negotiations with the general contractors and the city planning board. That's our final position, Keith, Brenda said, her tone hardening. If you choose to litigate, we will file a countersuit for breach of fiduciary duty, claiming you mismanaged the maintenance budget for the western parking structure. We have plenty of internal reports to support our claim. It will take you years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees just to get a court date. Take the $75,000 and move on. You're 46. You don't want to spend the rest of your career in court. I see, I said. I took the separation agreement, folded it, and placed it in my cardboard box. I'll have my attorney review it. You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow to sign it, Keith. After that, the offer is off the table and we will terminate you with cause, Brenda warned. I walked out of the building and drove straight to the law offices of Gable and Associates. Victor Gable had been my personal attorney and my grandfather's attorney for over 2 decades. He was a sharp, meticulous man who knew the history of every commercial parcel in the county. When I walked into his office and placed the cardboard box on his desk, Victor looked up, surprised. Fired you? Richard would never allow that. Richard is in Florida and Bradley is running the show now, I said, sitting down. They fired me to save my salary and avoid paying the $2.5 million Phase 2 bonus. They're replacing me with Bradley's brother-in-law, Donald. Victor let out a low whistle. Bradley Thorne, the kid always was an arrogant idiot. What about the ground lease? That's why I'm here, I said, pulling out the original 2006 commercial ground lease. They think they've got me cornered with their legal team. They think I'm going to sue them for the bonus and spend the next 5 years drowning in court fees. They have no idea about Section 14 DE. Victor smiled, his eyes lighting up as he reached for the document. Ah, Section 14D, your grandfather Howard was a very smart man. He knew that Richard Thorne was a decent partner, but he also knew that corporations change hands and family businesses get inherited by fools. Let's look at the wording again. We spent the next 3 hours dissecting the lease. The document was beautiful in its simplicity. My grandfather had leased the central 2.5-acre parcel to Omnispace Properties for a 20-year term ending in December 2026. The rent was set at $10,000 a month, but that was a subsidized rate. Section 14, the personnel keyman rider, explicitly stated that this rate was a personal accommodation to the Vance family, conditional upon Keith Vance being employed as the Senior Managing Director of Property Operations. If Keith Vance's employment is terminated for any reason other than voluntary resignation or termination for cause as defined by a criminal conviction, Victor read aloud, the lease rate subsidy shall immediately cease. The lease rate shall automatically adjust to the current fair market rental value of the property as determined by an independent appraisal conducted by a member of the Appraisal Institute. Such rate adjustment shall be retroactive to the first day of the current fiscal year. The current fiscal year started on November 1, 2025, I noted. That's exactly 6 months ago. Exactly, Victor said, tapping his pen on the desk. And since the Phase 2 expansion opened, the land value has skyrocketed. The land under Vanguard is now worth a premium. Let's order an expedited appraisal of that 2.5-acre parcel tomorrow. Once we get the valuation, we will send Bradley and the board a formal notice of lease rate adjustment and a bill for the retroactive rent difference. And what if they refuse to pay? I asked. Victor grinned. Then, under Section 14A, they are in material breach of the lease. If they fail to cure the breach within 14 business days of receiving the notice, the lease is terminated. We can legally block their access to the land, demand the removal of all structures, or evict their anchor tenant. Let's see how Bradley's spreadsheets handle a $300,000 a month rent bill and a tenant eviction notice from Vanguard. The independent appraisal took 5 days. Victor hired a senior member of the Appraisal Institute who specializes in high-density commercial developments. The appraiser didn't just look at local land sales. He analyzed the foot traffic, the tenant sales volume, and the fact that Vanguard Department Store generated $80 million in annual revenue from this specific site. Because Vanguard's flagship store sat directly on our land, the parcel was classified as a high-yield retail core. The final appraisal report came back with a shocking but fully justified number. The fair market rental value of the 2.5-acre parcel was $350,000 a month. Under the subsidized lease, OmniSpace had been paying $10,000. The difference was $340,000 a month. Retroactive to November 1st, 2025, which was exactly 6 months ago, the back rent adjustment came to $2,040,000. When you added the current month's rent of $350,000, the total bill due immediately was $2,390,000. To keep the math clean and aligned with the tax adjustments allowed under Section 14, Victor rounded the total demand to exactly $2,100,000, deducting some prepaid municipal drainage fees that my grandfather had covered. On May 10, 2026, Victor Gable drafted the formal notice of lease rate adjustment and demand for immediate payment. He attached the full 80-page appraisal report, a certified copy of the original 2006 lease showing Section 14D, and my formal notice of termination from OmniSpace. We didn't just mail it. Victor hired a professional process server to deliver the package directly to Bradley Thorne's executive assistant at OmniSpace headquarters. He also sent certified copies to every member of the board of directors and to the head of corporate leasing at Vanguard's national headquarters in Chicago. According to a friendly secretary in the corporate office who called me later that afternoon, Bradley's initial reaction was laughter. He apparently threw the letter onto Donald's desk and said, "Look at this. Vance is so desperate he's trying to extort us with a 20-year-old lease. He thinks he can raise our rent by 3,000% because we fired him. Tell the legal department to send him a standard cease and desist letter." Donald, who hadn't even opened the binder of tenant files I left him, agreed completely. He told Bradley that ground leases are permanent and that a tenant can't just change the rent on a whim. Neither of them bothered to read the actual contract, nor did they consult with Richard Thorne in Florida. The corporate legal department, swamped with the Phase 2 expansion filings, sent back a templated one-page rejection letter stating that OmniSpace Properties did not recognize the validity of the appraisal or the rate adjustment and considered the matter closed. They did not pay a single dollar of the adjusted rent. Victor and I sat in his office on May 25, 2026, the 15th business day after the notice had been legally served. The deadline for them to cure the default had expired at 5 p.m. the previous day. "They didn't pay," Victor said, looking at the bank ledger of the trust account where the lease payments were deposited. Only the standard $10,000 electronic transfer had been sent, which we immediately rejected and returned to their bank. "They are in material breach of the lease. Under Section 14E, you now have the absolute right to terminate the lease agreement, reclaim the parcel, and take possession of any structures built on it. More importantly, you have the right to exclude anyone from entering your property. Is the eviction notice ready?" I asked. "It's signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk," Victor said, pulling out a stack of documents. "And I've already notified Vanguard's corporate counsel. They are currently in a state of absolute panic. Their legal team in Chicago realized that if the ground lease is terminated, their lease with OmniSpace is void because OmniSpace no longer controls the land under their building. Vanguard's contract has a standard quiet enjoyment clause. If they get evicted, OmniSpace will be liable for every dollar of lost revenue, which is about $220,000 a day. Let's make sure they see we mean business," I said. "I'm not going to let Bradley sit in his office and ignore this. We need to physically assert our ownership." I called a licensed bonded commercial fencing contractor I had worked with for years. I also hired 2 off-duty county sheriff deputies to oversee the work and ensure there was no breach of the peace. I paid the fencing crew a double-time rate to show up at the mall at midnight on May 26th with 3 flatbed trucks loaded with 8-foot-tall, heavy-duty commercial steel chain-link panels. At 12:30 a.m., under the bright yellow parking lot lights, the crew began drilling holes into the asphalt along the exact property lines of my grandfather's parcel. We didn't fence the entire mall, just the 2.5 acres in the center. The fence ran directly across the main pedestrian entrance plaza, sliced through the outdoor dining patio of 2 high-end restaurants, and completely enclosed the loading docks and the primary entrance of the Vanguard department store. I stood there holding the original 1988 county surveyor map, showing the crew exactly where to place the steel posts. By 3 a.m., a massive, impenetrable steel barrier stood in the middle of the Pinnacle Galleria. Bright red signs were bolted to the chain-link panels every 10 feet reading, "Private property, no trespassing, access restricted by ogre, off-years and only." The off-duty deputies sat in their patrol car with their lights flashing, monitoring the perimeter. I stayed in my car drinking black coffee, waiting for the sun to rise. I knew that the mall's morning shift started at 6 a.m., and Vanguard's delivery trucks usually arrived at 6:30. Bradley Thorne had spent his entire life thinking that power came from titles, board seats, and executive offices. He was about to learn that real power comes from the dirt. You can own a $100 million building, but if you don't own the ground it stands on, you're just a tenant waiting to be evicted. And when the tenant insults the landlord has every right to lock the front door. At 6:15 a.m., the first 18-wheeler Vanguard delivery truck rolled into the rear service road of the Pinnacle Galleria, it carrying $50,000 worth of spring apparel. As the driver rounded the bend toward the loading dock, he slammed on his brakes. A steel chain-link wall blocked the entire road with two county sheriff cruiser cars parked right in front of it. The driver got out, scratching his head, and walked up to the fence. The deputy pointed to the large red sign. "Private land, buddy. You can't park here, and you can't cross. You'll have to back the rig out." By 6:45 a.m., Edward Cooper, the Vanguard store manager, arrived at the employee entrance. He couldn't even reach the door. The fence was bolted directly into the concrete just 3 feet from the building's threshold. Cooper immediately called Donald Finch. "Donald, what the hell is going on? There's a steel fence blocking our loading dock and our main doors. We have 3 trucks backed up on the service road, and my staff can't get in to open the registers. We are supposed to open in 2 hours. Donald, who was likely still asleep, sounded confused. "A fence? What do you mean, a fence? The mall maintenance crew must be doing asphalt repairs. I'll call security. This isn't maintenance, Donald," Cooper shouted. "There are sheriff deputies here protecting the fence. They have signs saying it's private property. Get down here now." Donald arrived 20 minutes later, his tie undone and his jacket rumpled. He marched up to the fence, screaming at the deputies. "Do you know who I am? I'm the director of property operations. This is our mall. Get these fences down immediately, or I'll have you all fired." The deputy didn't budge. He stepped out of his car, resting his hand on his utility belt. "Sir, we are off-duty deputies hired to prevent trespassing on private property. This parcel belongs to the Howard Vance estate, managed by Keith Vance. We have a certified copy of the deed, the lease termination notice filed with the county clerk, and a trespass warning. If you step over this painted line or attempt to dismantle this fence, you will be arrested for criminal trespass and destruction of property." Donald went pale. He immediately called Bradley. By 8 a.m., a crowd of over 100 Vanguard employees and early morning mall walkers stood around the perimeter of the fence, taking photos and videos. The local news channel's van pulled into the parking lot. The headline on the morning broadcast read, "Land dispute shuts down mall anchor store." My phone started ringing at 8:15 a.m. It was Bradley. I let it ring. He called again and again. Over the next 3 hours, I received 47 missed calls from Bradley Thorne, 12 from Brenda Croft, and 4 from the mall's security desk. I didn't answer a single one. At 10 a.m., a call came from an unfamiliar number with a Florida area code. I answered. "Keith?" The voice on the other end was weak, raspy, but instantly recognizable. It was Richard Thorne. "Hello, Richard," I said calmly. "I heard you were in Florida." "Keith, what in God's name is happening at the Galleria?" Richard coughed, sounding exhausted. "I'm sitting here looking at a live news feed of a steel fence blocking Vanguard's front doors. The chairman of Vanguard's board just called me on my private line. They've already suspended rent payments for the entire mall, and they're preparing a $15 million lawsuit for breach of our operating covenant. They say we don't own the land." "We don't, Richard," I said. "Your son Bradley fired me to save my salary and avoid paying my Phase 2 bonus. By doing so, he voided the ground lease subsidy under Section 14D. I sent him the formal rate adjustment notice and the bill for the retroactive rent on May 10th. He ignored it and refused to pay. The cure period expired yesterday at 5 p.m. The lease is terminated. The land is mine again." There was a long silence on the line. I could hear Richard breathing heavily. "Section 14D," Richard whispered. "That idiot son of mine, he didn't read the ground lease. He didn't even look at the file." "No, he didn't," I said. "He was too busy telling everyone my role was redundant." "Keith, please, we need to resolve this," Richard pleaded. "I'm boarding my private jet in 30 minutes. I will be in your attorney's office by 3 p.m. Please, tell your crew to let Vanguard open. We are losing hundreds of thousands of dollars a minute." "Vanguard can open when we have an agreement, Richard," I said. "I'll see you at 3. At 3 p.m. sharp, the conference room at Gable & Associates was packed. Richard Thorne sat at the head of the table, looking frail but sharp-eyed. Next to him was Bradley, who looked completely defeated, his arrogant swagger gone. Brenda Croft and 3 corporate lawyers sat opposite Victor and me. Bradley tried to start the meeting by pointing a finger at me. "This is illegal. You're holding our tenant hostage to extort us. We will file an emergency injunction to have those fences removed." Victor Gable didn't even look up from his papers. He slid a folder across the table to Omnispace's lead attorney. "Go ahead and file. But before you do, read the 2006 lease agreement, the county clerk filings, and the independent appraisal report." Your client was served with a legal notice 15 days ago. They chose to ignore it and sent a formal rejection. Under state law, we have followed the eviction process to the letter. If you go before a judge, the first thing he will ask is why your client failed to pay the rent. And if the judge looks at Section 14DE, he will tell you that the contract is completely clear. You fired Keith Vance without cause, and the rent went up. You didn't pay. You defaulted. The land is ours. Omnispace's lead lawyer reviewed the documents for less than 2 minutes. He leaned over and whispered in Richard's ear. Richard closed his eyes and nodded slowly. Then he looked at his son. "Shut up, Bradley," Richard said, his voice quiet but sharp. "You've ruined 15 years of partnership in 6 months because you wanted to save $200,000. You're an idiot." He turned to me. "Keith, what are your terms?" I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the glass table. "The terms are straightforward, Richard. I'm not here to destroy Omnispace, but I am going to get what is contractually and legally mine. First, you will wire the full $2,500,000 Phase 2 development bonus to Victor's trust account by noon tomorrow. Second, you will pay the outstanding retroactive rent adjustment of $2,100,000. Third, you will pay $50,000 to cover the costs of my fencing contractor, the security deputies, and Victor's legal fees." Bradley stood up, his face red. $4.6 million? That's extortion. Dad, we can't pay this. It will wipe out our entire operating cash flow for the next 2 quarters. "Sit down, Bradley," Richard growled, his voice freezing his son in place. He looked back at me. "And what about the ground lease going forward, Keith? We can't operate the Galleria if we are paying $350,000 a month for the Vanguard parcel. That's $4.2 million a year. The numbers don't work." "I'm willing to sign a new lease," I said, "but the terms will be different. We will sign a new 10-year commercial ground lease for the 2.5 acres. The rent will be $15,000 a month, a minor adjustment from the old $10,000 rate. However, Omnispace will sign a separate, non-terminable service contract with Vance Consulting Group, my private holding company. My firm will be retained as the permanent senior operations consultant for the Pinnacle Galleria. The consulting fee will be $15,000 a month, paid on the first of every month, regardless of whether you actually ask for my advice. This contract will be linked to the ground lease. If you terminate the consulting contract, the ground lease default clause is triggered immediately." Bradley looked like he was about to explode. "A $15,000 a month pension for doing nothing? You're insane." "I'm not doing nothing, Bradley," I said. "I'm allowing your mall to exist, and that brings me to my final condition. You, Bradley, are stripped of all operational authority over the Pinnacle Galleria. You will have no contact with the tenants, no control over the budget, and no presence on the property. Donald Finch is terminated immediately, effective today, and Brenda Croft will be replaced as HR director by someone who actually knows how to read an employment contract." Brenda sat up straight, her mouth opening in shock. "Richard, you can't let him dictate our personnel decisions." Richard didn't even look at her. He was staring at the table, calculating the alternative. "If they fought me in court, Vanguard would close. If Vanguard closed, every major tenant in the mall, Apple, Sephora, Lululemon, would immediately trigger their co-tenancy clauses. Under those clauses, if the anchor store remains closed for more than 30 days, the other retailers have the right to pay only 50% of their rent or terminate their leases entirely. The Pinnacle Galleria's valuation would crash from $120 million to $40 million in a matter of weeks. The bank would foreclose on the construction loans for Phase 2, and Omnispace Properties would face bankruptcy." Richard looked up. His eyes were tired, but they were the eyes of a real businessman who knew when he had been beaten. "We accept the terms. Have your lawyers draft the agreements, Victor. We will have the corporate seal on them by tomorrow morning, and the wire transfers will be initiated immediately." "Dad!" Bradley yelled. "Get out of the room, Bradley," Richard said softly. "Go back to the office, pack your files, and prepare to move to our regional office in Fargo, North Dakota. You'll be managing the strip malls there. Maybe you can learn how to read a lease contract when the temperature is 20 below zero." By noon the next day, the wire transfers had cleared. The funds, exactly $4,650,000, were sitting in Victor's escrow account. The new ground lease and the non-terminable consulting agreement were signed and notarized. At 1 p.m., I called the fencing contractor. Within 2 hours, the steel chain-link panels were dismantled, loaded onto the flatbeds, and hauled away. The loading docks were cleared. By 3 p.m., the Vanguard department store was fully open to the public, and the delivery trucks were unloading their cargo. The shoppers returned. The patio tables were set back up, and the mall returned to its busy, profitable routine. Donald Finch was escorted from the property by mall security that afternoon, carrying his things in a cardboard box. Brenda Croft resigned the following Monday, citing personal reasons. Bradley Thorne was on a flight to North Dakota by the end of the week, his brief tenure as a corporate titan coming to a cold, remote end. I took early retirement at 46. With the $4.6 million in cash and my monthly income of $30,000, $15,000 from the ground lease and $15,000 from the consulting retainer, I had no need to ever step foot in an office again. A few weeks ago, I drove by the Pinnacle Galleria on my way to the coast. I parked in the common lot and walked through the main plaza. I saw the shoppers carrying their Vanguard bags, the kids playing by the fountain, and the polished glass windows. I looked down at the concrete paving stones beneath my feet. I smiled, knowing that no matter how big the buildings get or how arrogant the corporate suits become, they are always standing on someone else's dirt. And as long as they are on my dirt, they will pay their rent.